Hey there, friends, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind, a podcast for highly sensitive people. I'm your host, Erica Webb, highly sensitive person and neurodivergent. I am a registered counsellor, somatic exercise coach, and yoga teacher, working with other highly sensitive folk who perhaps find it a little bit difficult to navigate what it means to be sensitive in a world that often just feels so insensitive to your needs. So, welcome to this episode. What I wanted to talk about today is something that I see tripping us up quite often, but I think that something that sort of sits outside of our awareness. And so I wanted to bring it out and talk a little bit about it because I think it's really important. And that's this idea of knowing what matters to you. We call this values. And I always struggle to talk about values without putting a little caveat in, because sometimes when we start talking about values, people tune out, right? They turn off, tune out, because values have got a bit of a reputation as being a little bit of fluff. And I think that that comes from the way that they've been used in corporate environments where it feels a little bit like lip service, right? Where yeah, we know what the values are, but like we can see that we're not necessarily living them or that the organization isn't necessarily living them consistently. And so it can feel a little bit like meh, right? Easy to dismiss. But when it comes to being a highly sensitive person in the world or just a person in the world, knowing what matters to you and knowing your values is actually really, really valuable and important. And what I have seen happen over and over again for highly sensitive people is a sense of dis-ease, a sense of distress, overwhelm, misalignment that often stems from being in environments and situations and doing things that actually don't align with their values. One of the things that often doesn't get talked about as a highly sensitive person is how important it is to feel like you are doing something that matters, right? And it doesn't have to be world peace, right? But some sense of purpose and a sense of being aligned with what matters to you is so deeply important to highly sensitive people. Some of us are very, very rule oriented and we're very good at following whatever the rules are, right? And that can be wonderful, but it can also get us into situations where we find ourselves following rules, but feeling completely misaligned. And this is where I think it's really important to recognize the difference between rules and values. And I think it's really important as a highly sensitive person to understand what you care about, to understand what's deeply important to you. Because when you know that, then when you are faced with a situation where perhaps it's a values mismatch, it's a challenge or a struggle related to my values don't match their values, or my values don't match what I'm supposed to be doing here, and I feel like a sense of disease around that. That can be something that we can get a little bit more curious about and we can work with in a different way. Whereas when we aren't aware of that values mismatch or what we actually care about, what matters to us most, then we will turn our blame and sense of like what is wrong squarely on us, right? We'll be like, there must just be something wrong with me. Why can't I just get this done? Why can't I just be okay at work? Why can't I just get on with it like everybody else? So understanding what matters to you is so, so valuable. I had a situation actually last week where on paper, I was given an opportunity to do something that seemed like a great idea. I was all in. I started doing the things that I needed to do to kind of deliver on that thing. And then I noticed that I had a real sense of anxiety around it that I couldn't quite pin down. And after sitting with it for a while, I recognized that what I was doing just felt so misaligned with my values. But on paper, it was fine, right? And so once I had that recognition, I was like, oh, this is why this feels like so insurmountable. This is why this feels really hard, because it actually is bumping up against what I've decided is the most important to me. So it can help us to be a lot more self-compassionate, I think, when we know what matters most to us. And I think in my role as a counselor, the places that I see this show up most often are in workplaces and relationships. So like, nothing small, all the big stuff, where we're sort of stuck in these loops of thinking that make it again look like maybe there's something wrong with us, right? Like we're not trying hard enough, we don't care enough, we can't kind of get out of this sort of ruminating state that we find ourselves in. But often what's underneath that is that our values are mismatched to the places and spaces that we find ourselves. Because if we value honesty and integrity, and we're in environments where people aren't being honest and people aren't being in integrity, we will find that as highly sensitive people incredibly difficult. Now, it's not impossible to stay in those environments, of course. And sometimes, we have to be in environments where things are happening that we don't necessarily love or approve of. But I think it can be really helpful to acknowledge, the behavior of this person or the behavior of that organization or the behavior of this collective, it doesn't match what I have decided is really important to me. So then when we know that, we can have more compassion for ourselves. We can potentially also have a lot more compassion for the people outside of ourselves. But then we also open up to what are our true options. So we stop just turning on ourselves and we can turn to look at, okay, well, what are my options in the light of what I now recognize, in the light of what I now know? So to back up a little bit, values speak to the things that we have decided are most important to us in terms of how we show up in our behavior in the world. I've talked before about how in some of my earlier jobs, before I started working for myself, I worked in corporates, and I was so burnt out in those environments. And I put a lot of that down to a mismatch of values. I didn't know how to navigate that at the time. I was young. I was probably really quite naive. And I found myself in situations often where there was just this rub between what I thought was right and what I was expected to do. And that is like kryptonite for a highly sensitive person. That is really a very difficult situation to find yourself in. And I think that in our world, we find ourselves in those situations more often than not. But again, like I said, are we aware of what it's about? Are we aware of the fact that it's a values misalignment rather than something wrong with us? So what I want to invite you to do this week is have a think about what your values are. I have a process for this inside the SelfKind Hub, which if you haven't heard about the SelfKind Hub before, that's my online group membership for highly sensitive and neurodivergent people. It primarily centers around a library of movement classes, somatic and yoga classes that are really gentle and designed to help you meet yourself with kindness, compassion, and unwind the physical tension that tends to build up in our sensitive bodies. But in there, I also have masterclasses and some mini programs that are really directed at some of the challenges that we face as highly sensitive people. And one of those mini programs is around identifying your values. So I'm going to pop a link for that in the show notes. You can join for a month and just, cancel once you've done the program if you want to, or you can join us for longer and explore all the different things that we've got in there. But that process will help you to not only identify what your values are, but also how you can show up in them more often, how you can actually live them. Because that's the thing, that's the rub, right? So this is kind of two parts. One, if you don't know what your values are, you don't know when you are in misalignment with them, but you will know on the inside that something doesn't feel right. You just won't be able to articulate what it is. So being able to have the language for that is really, really important. But then the other part of that is showing up in your values more often. Because here's the thing, you are human. I am human. Sometimes I do things that are absolutely at odds with my values and it doesn't feel great, right? You will do this too. But when we know what's more important to us, when we kind of have this sense of like, well, no, honesty and integrity and compassion or whatever the words are for you, these are the things that are important to me. It helps us to not only figure out how we're going to show up in spaces, but it also can help us navigate decisions. Like that example that I used before, where I was talking about this opportunity that kind of fell in my lap last week, and I chose not to take it because when it came down to making that kind of final decision, I ran it through my values and I was like, oh, that's why this doesn't feel right. It is completely misaligned. So it can be this way of decision making too, which for highly sensitive people is super valuable, because I don't know about you, but making decisions as a highly sensitive person is one of the hardest things that I face. I feel like such an indecisive person a lot of the time. But being able to recognize and run decisions through my values lens is really, really helpful. So I want to throw that out there. You can, like I said, come to the SelfKind Hub and work through the process that I've got there, but there's also lots and lots of tools online. So you've got loads of ways to do that. If you just sort of type in values checklist or something like that into Google, you'll also find a bunch of stuff there. But the key here is to not just come up with the words and then stick them on a post-it note and bury it under a pile of papers, but to really think about how could this show up in my life? I'll give you a few examples from my own life, with the hopes that it helps to kind of bring this into the real world a little bit for you. So a couple of my highest values are presence and honesty and compassion. So in terms of that honesty piece, I really use that as a lens of how I communicate with other people, because sometimes I can really fall into a sense of wanting to people please. But being honest is actually more important to me, because I want people to be honest with me. And so I really want to be honest with them. And so sometimes if I'm able to kind of acknowledge that, oh, I'm about to fall into people pleasing, but that's not what's important to me. What's actually important to me is being honest. Then I'll save myself the after effects of people pleasing sometimes, right? Because I can be like, well, no, hang on. The honesty part is the important part for me. So even if this is slightly uncomfortable now, can I be honest? Because that's how I want to show up in the world. Another example with the present stuff, that one's probably the hardest for me to kind of align myself with, because ADHD, right? And so sometimes being present feels really hard. And I'm constantly kind of like, I've got this to do, I've got that to do, and I'm busy, right? Like I've got a lot of things that I do, and so being present can sometimes feel a little bit tricky. But there are times where I just have that in my mind of like, no, being present is important. Being present is important to you, not a should, not a moral kind of thing, not something that I use to beat myself over the head, but a way of reminding myself of it feels good to be present with other people and with the things that I'm doing. It feels good to shut off the distractions. It feels good to really give my kids my full attention. And so it's this way of kind of guiding our behavior, but with a really loving, kind, compassionate, gentle hand, rather than this kind of like, you should do this, you should do that, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And that's where we can acknowledge the difference between a value and a rule. So as a highly sensitive person, you might find that you are very good at following rules. You know what the rules are, you know where the boundaries are. It helps you to feel safe. Sometimes, though, those rules will go against your values. And so it's really important that we recognize the difference and that we don't put ourselves in rule-bound boxes, but instead we give ourselves the flexibility of understanding our values and choosing to show up in them as often as we possibly can. And I think when we get out of rules as highly sensitive people and we turn more towards values, it can help us to feel so much more aligned. And that should not be underestimated as a highly sensitive person, because that disconnect that we feel, that rub against what is important to us and what's actually happening, that can be incredibly distressing as a highly sensitive soul, because you're sensitive and these things matter, right? So I would love to know, if you do dive in and have a look at your values, what are your aha moments? What do you notice about what shows up there for you? It's important to recognize that it's not about what you already do, it's about what you truly want. And so if I, use that example of presence again, I'm not always present. And so it's not about trying to pull from my life, or what does the evidence show me is important to me? It's actually more about digging deeply into you to figure out what is important to me. Not how am I already showing up? There might be clues there, yes, but often we are not consciously living the way that we would like to, right? And so we often get stuck in the rules that we've developed for ourselves over time, which may no longer be working for us. And we also get kind of fixed into relationship dynamics that just operate the way they operate because that's how they've always operated. And so it's interesting to uncover the element of choice that we have as grown-up humans and to really get clear on what's important to us. So let me know how you go if you do dive into that. You might already know what yours are. And so if that is the case, then use this episode as a prompt to get curious about how can you use that knowledge, how can you use that information this week? And if you do know your values, but you haven't reviewed them for a while, it can be really helpful to do that too, because at different phases and stages of life, they will change. Because at the end of the day, when you go through a values exercise, you're looking for your core values, not everything that is a value to you, because that list will be very, very long. But you're looking for the core ones and the ones that help you to show up in the world the way you'd like to. And so depending on what stage you're at in life and what phase you're at, that will be different, right? If you're in a phase where you're like, I really want to get to the point where I am more self-accepting and caring for my needs, then you might choose something that directs you towards that kind of behavior as a focus for this point in your life. If you're more focused on relationships or something else, then you'll choose other values, right? And it's not that your values don't spread across different different places and spaces. Like they will all be relevant in certain areas. But I do find that it can be very helpful to think about your values in terms of where perhaps am I not showing up in ways that I want to, where doing so would make a really big difference. And so that needs to be my focus for now. So the presence one for me is a huge one. And at various other times, it's been self-compassion and kindness, because I was finding that my own self-care and my own sense of being nurtured was kind of falling off the back of the train kind of thing. And so those values words were more important to me in those periods. They're still important to me now, but right, they change relative depending on what's going on. So anyway, I've been wrapping up for the last 5 minutes. I'm going to wrap up for real now. Let me know how you go. Come and share with me over on Instagram, or leave me a comment if you're here on YouTube. If you are listening on a podcast app, come and find me on Instagram. But a reminder, SelfKind Hub. I would love for you to join us over there and take that values inventory, that values mini program. I'll pop the link in the show notes, and I will see you soon, back really soon with another episode.